Iudicamet Deus et discerne causam meam degerter sancta.
Well, hello everybody, and welcome. Thank you for joining the first of two sessions on the theme of encounter with Jesus, or maybe I should say, as I change the title a little, the Jesus of encounter. So we can begin. Right? I just have to get some of this distracting stuff off from me here. There we go. So my first question is just, what is an encounter anyway? Is it just a meeting? So I did what I used to tell my students not to do. Please don't tell me what Webster says. But in fact, I did check the dictionary, and I learned that encounter often has a very negative connotation. For example, enemies encounter each other, or we might be able to encounter a bear. Or maybe it's just a meeting that has happened and it's a kind of a surprise. So it's an encounter. And here we have some young folks encountering each other. It's very nice. But Pope Francis took the word and he did something very different with it, as he spoke often of the culture of encounter. And in fact, he developed that notion of a culture of encounter into his encyclical Fratelli Tutti, which contemplated what such a culture could accomplish. For Francis, a culture of encounter would act as a place of dialogue. He wanted people to listen and talk with each other, just about as simple as that. And yet, when we look at our world, and even in our own lives, I think we can see how hard, how even impossible sometimes that can be. And that's especially true when you've tried it and you've failed. As I was getting ready for Lent and for these talks, I came to understand that encounter in the Franciscan sense of the word, or maybe I should say the Christ-like sense of the word, is at the heart of what we're called to as baptized members of the body, the same body. So it shouldn't come as any surprise then that Jesus would be our guide to answering that call to encounter. His ways of meeting people where they were offer us ways to answer the same call to encounter. So Francis really insisted on looking within. Early in his pontificate, Francis preached on Luke's story of Jesus's encounter with the widow of Nain. You remember the story goes like this. As he drew near the gates of the city, a man who had died was being carried out, the only son of his mother, and she was a widow. A large crowd from the city was with her. When the Lord saw her, he was moved with pity for her and said, "Do not weep." He stepped forward and touched the coffin. At this, the bearers halted, and he said, "Young man, I tell you, arise." The dead man sat up and began to speak, and Jesus gave him to his mother. This passage from the Word of God, says Francis, speaks of an unusual encounter. Well, why was it unusual? Because, he says, when we go into the street, every man thinks of himself. He sees, but he doesn't look. He hears, but he doesn't listen. In short, everyone goes their own way. It's not exactly brain surgery to know that. And Francis tells us people pass each other, but they don't encounter each other. An encounter is something else. So again, what is it? So he says, the gospel says, when the Lord saw her, he had compassion on her. This compassion is not the same as what we normally feel when we see something sad and we say, "Oh, what a shame, what a pity." Jesus didn't say, "Oh, that poor lady," and keep on moving. No, in fact, seized with compassion, he drew near and he said, "Do not weep." My cursor is in the wrong place here. There we go. So he drew near, he spoke, and he touched. According to the narrative, he touched the coffin. Surely, however, when he said, "Do not weep," he touched the widow as well, because Jesus was moved. He allowed himself to be moved. And then he raised the young man to life. Jesus' action truly shows not only tenderness, but also fruitfulness. Jesus returned him to his mother. He didn't say, according to Francis now, he didn't say, "Well, the miracle's done. Glad you're happy." No, he said, "Come, take him. He's yours." That is why, says Pope Francis, every encounter is fruitful. Each encounter returns people and things to their place. That insight, every encounter is fruitful. Each encounter returns people and things to their place, will be helpful to us as we encounter the gospel accounts now. I hope that the truth of it may also help us to recognize the life-giving power in our own encounters with Jesus. Something happens if we allow it. And sometimes we don't allow it. I certainly know that too. But if we allow it, things happen. After meeting him, whether in prayer, in the Word, in the Eucharist, or in other people, we're not the same as we were before. So I'm going to talk first about two very little short moments in the gospel and then develop that. So there's two brief encounters first. Moments where people or Jesus meets people with the same pattern Pope Francis noticed. He sees, he draws near, he touches, and someone or something is restored to its rightful place. So, for example, you'll remember in Mark chapter 7, people brought to him a deaf man who had a speech impediment and begged him to lay his hand on him. The deaf man can't ask for himself. Others push him forward and speak for him. And it's good to have friends, But it's also often painful to be so dependent on the goodwill of others, others' decisions about what's good for you. He took him off by himself away from the crowd. He put his finger into the man's ears, and spitting, touched his tongue. So, sensing his need for dignity, Jesus takes him away from the noise, away from the pressure, away from all those eyes, kindly or not kindly, and he touches the place of his pain, and he says a single word, ephata, be opened. And the man's whole world opens. His encounter with Jesus, I'd say it was arranged by the Holy Spirit as well as by his friends, restores him to his place, to his dignity, to his community, really, to himself. Or we can think about the woman who had been bleeding for 12 years, exhausted, isolated. She was totally out of options. She reaches for Jesus in secret, hoping only for a touch of his cloak. But he stops. He asks, who touched him? And even when his disciples scoff at that, he keeps looking for her. And when she tells him everything, he replies, daughter, your faith has saved you. Go in peace and be cured of your affliction. He praises her faith. He blesses her with peace. He sends her home healed, and he calls her daughter. She had been anonymous, and now she has identity and a name, daughter. Now, the deaf man was brought to Jesus by other people, and the bleeding woman comes alone in the midst of the crowd. Either way, they're naked in their need. In his brief moment with each, Jesus brings all of himself to the encounter. In the process of giving himself away, he restores them to life. So after these two brief moments, the deaf man taken aside out of respect, and the woman drawn out of hiding and named daughter, we're going to take a look at some longer encounters. These stories give us room to linger, to watch Jesus move, to listen to the tone of his voice, to notice what awakens in the people that he meets. They can also give us room to think about or notice what might awaken in our own selves. So we're going to be spending time with the call of Peter in Luke chapter 5. The woman taken in adultery in John chapter 8, and the story of Zacchaeus in Luke chapter 19. So we'll begin with the call of Peter. Now, the evangelist Mark, writing about 15 years before Luke, gives an extremely brief account of Jesus' call of the disciples. In Mark, Jesus walks along the seashore, sees Simon and Andrew, and a little bit farther down the beach, he sees James and John, calls them, and they follow him. That's the whole call part. Luke, however, develops this material by focusing attention on the dialogue between Jesus and Simon, their encounter. He also frames the scene. We see fishermen on the beach washing their nets, a crowd of people dogging Jesus' heels, wanting to hear from him, maybe hoping to see more miraculous cures. Jesus has been very active in and around Capernaum, including healing Simon's mother-in-law of a fever. But this seems to be the first real encounter between the two. Jesus shows some chutzpah here. He gets into Simon's boat and he asks him to shove off so that he can preach to the crowd without being crushed. Now, Simon had been on the shore with the net washers, but now he gets aboard and he does as Jesus asks. Maybe he feels in his debt because of the healing of his mother-in-law. Maybe not. Maybe he's simply curious. At any rate, when Jesus asks for help, he gives it, pulling out a few yards from the shore without any comment. But when the landlubber from Nazareth tells him to put out into the deep for a catch, that is too much for this fisherman. Fishing on Lake Gennesaret, also known as the Sea of Galilee, was done only at night. So if professional fishermen hadn't caught anything by dawn, there were no fish to be had that day. So he protests, but then something in him prompts him to do it anyway. And then we're caught up in the text, in the drama of the catch itself. They caught a great number of fish and their nets were tearing. They signaled to their partners in the other boat to come to help. The catch filled both boats so that they were in danger of sinking. Well, what was it that pushed Simon to raise the anchor and head out into the deep? Luke doesn't say, but I'd venture a guess that it could have been connected to Jesus' recognizing the feelings of Simon and his crew. They'd had a failed night, a lot of pain, and no gain. Jesus offers hope. His mighty deeds were common knowledge in the neighborhood. After all, one had just happened right in Simon's own house. And they'd probably been listening there to his teaching from the boat. So that all had to be in Simon's mind. Now, still, it would have been very natural, I think, to say, "Sorry, mister, we're done." But instead, Simon calls Jesus master and goes out into the deep. He takes a chance. I've been saying that Jesus meets people where they are, but I think we can see that Simon meets Jesus where Jesus is too. Simon's caught up in the whole give and take dynamic of this encounter. It's not an everyday moment, usual humdrum stuff. It's a charged moment, a moment of kairos, that right moment where things change, where things are revealed. And this is illuminated by his response to that incredible catch of fish. This tough Galilean fisherman drops down at the knees of Jesus and says, "Depart from me, Lord, for I am a sinful man." We're used to having heard that many times in Sunday Gospels. But let's just think about that for a second. In that very moment, Peter has been given the grace to know himself. And then I just invite you, try to imagine what hearing that must have been like for the other guys in the boat. If the characterization of Simon Peter as told by the evangelists is at all accurate, he was not a meek man. And he didn't usually manifest a lot of self-knowledge. But there it was. Certainly, when he said those words to Jesus, he was placed squarely in the truth. In the truth. And so when the truth himself predicted, "From now on, you will be catching men," the only thing he could do was to leave everything behind and follow Jesus. So, encounter number one. Now, our next passage, or pericope, if you'd like to use a nice Greek term that means basically a biblical passage, gospel passage, is found at the beginning of John in chapter 8. It's the story of the woman taken in adultery. And for those of you who are biblical scholars, which I am not, I'm sure you're saying to yourselves, "Yeah, but lots of people don't think this is really original in the John text." Yes, but nevertheless, it's good for what we're thinking about, which is encounter with Jesus. So the woman taken in adultery. Our attention shifts dramatically here from the watery, fishy world of Jesus's early Galilean ministry to the temple area in noisy, dusty Jerusalem. And this is not too long before he will be betrayed and killed. We've moved from way up in the backwoods, like maybe somewhere in northwestern Maine, dare I say Jackman, Maine, uh, to what might be called the hub of Jewish life. So that's a little New England humor there for those of us who are from here. At any rate, Jerusalem and the temple differ from the sea, the shores of the Sea of Galilee, excuse me, not only physically, but also because of who's listening and how they're receiving what he's saying. And that's, I think, a really important point. Up in Galilee, it's mostly kind of simple people, maybe a few Pharisees that are thrown in there, but on the whole, it's people like Peter and his mother-in-law. But here in Jerusalem, it's a different class of people, people that are far more invested, I think, in the law, keeping the law, and making sure others kept the law as well, for various reasons. At any rate, so those who fling the woman into the center of the area in front of Jesus are not seeking encounter with him in the sense that Pope Francis uses that word. And yet, despite their best efforts of avoiding such an encounter, it comes to them anyway. When he bends down and begins to write on the ground with his finger, they keep pressing on, addressing him sarcastically as teacher, shouting their fake question at him, asking him for his ruling on the fate of that woman, demanding that he parse the law of Moses concerning adultery. A wrong answer here could be deadly, not only for her, but for him. But he refuses to enter the logic of accusation. He refuses to let their fury or the woman's terror set the terms of the encounter. He creates space, a pause, a breath, where something new can happen. For a short passage like this, I think it's really interesting to see just how much silence there is in it. In the midst of all the chest pounding and bellowing that's going on all around, Jesus says nothing, and neither does she. His bending down is not avoidance, it's a deliberate interruption of the momentum of violence. It creates a pocket of time in which their certainty can falter. And when he finally speaks, well, we know his words are very simple. Let the one among you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone. And then he bends down again. He simply lets the truth do its work. The truth again. And one by one they leave, stones thudding to the ground as they walk away. Now he straightens up, and he finds her looking at him in confusion and fear. What will he do now that everyone else has cleared off? Before addressing her, he regards her, seeing her in her totality, in a way that she may never have been seen before. Not by her tormentors, for sure, not by the man who ran off and left her to her fate, maybe not even by herself, perhaps most completely not by herself. He sees her fear, her shame, her complete vulnerability, but he also sees someone made in God's image and likeness. Tattered, tarnished, battered, yeah, but the likeness is still there. So this moment of silence is compassionate and not harsh. That's not a surprise, but it's a silent moment. And then he asks the question, has no one condemned you? No one, sir, she says. Then neither do I condemn you. Neither do I condemn you. He sends her on her way then, and his words, go and do not sin anymore are not a curt dismissal. Instead, I would say they effect a kind of restoration. The woman who was dragged into the center as an object is now addressed as someone capable of acting in freedom, of avoiding that sin from now on. Jesus returns her to her rightful place, not by denying her past, and doesn't say, I forgive you either, but he doesn't allow her to be defined by it either. He sends her out kind of on a mission, I suppose, to avoid that sin, to live a different way. If we look through the lens that Pope Francis gave us, every encounter is fruitful. Each encounter returns people and things to their place. We can see the pattern again. Jesus sees her as herself and not as bait in a trap set by his enemies. He draws near by entering into that same circle of danger rather than avoiding it. And finally, he touches her. Well, here in this photo from this film, he touches her physically. In the gospel, it doesn't say that, but he does touch her with, I would say, the tenderness of truth, spoken without condemnation. So finally, we move from a woman dragged into the center in shame to a man who climbs a tree in curiosity and joy. And I really like this. I guess it's an icon, but it's kind of, yeah, I like all the people looking at Zacchaeus there. From someone stripped of agency to another who can act as he likes. She receives her dignity back from Jesus, perhaps for the first time in her life. Zacchaeus, through his encounter with Jesus, experiences a deeper truth about himself as a child of Abraham. Now, I imagine that even tall people can identify with Zacchaeus. But for short people like yours truly, he's a patron saint. And he's also symbolic, I suppose, of all our littleness in the face of so much bigness out there. How do we live with that? What do we do with it? How does it shape our deepest desires when we, from our little standpoint, face the big world and the big forces that are constantly trying to, I don't know, push us around and don't even try it, they do. The detail of Zacchaeus climbing a sycamore tree for a better look at Jesus because he couldn't see over the crowd, well, it is a bit comic, but it also answers those questions. Zacchaeus found a way to see the one he'd heard about and to be seen by him as well. Now, Luke builds a surprise into the story. It's not clear in the narration that Zacchaeus expects an encounter with Jesus when he climbs the tree. All he wanted to do was just try to see him, something that is mentioned twice in the text. He tried to see. He wanted to try to see him. And here's something really interesting about that word. I learned that when I was preparing this, I learned that Luke uses the word zeteo here. And that's translated here as try, but apparently its literal meaning is seek. By means of this word, the evangelist sets up a verbal link with the conclusion of the story when Jesus declares that the Son of Man has come to seek and save what is lost. So Zacchaeus seeks to see, not knowing that he's being sought. And I just wonder whether that might resonate with your experience. I think that many of us begin by seeking Jesus in small, almost tentative ways, not realizing that the deeper truth is that we're already being sought. Or if we realize it, we forget it and we have to remember it again. So Zacchaeus might be more than just a patron saint for short people. He might be a patron saint for people that want to try to see Jesus. At any rate, Jesus seeks after Zacchaeus and he addresses the little guy up in the branches. Zacchaeus, he knows his name. Come down quickly, for today I must stay in your house. Today I must stay at your house. And Zacchaeus scrambles down, flinging any last concern for dignity to the winds as he does so. He welcomes him joyfully. That's another word that Luke uses when he describes how Martha in chapter 10 of Luke, how she welcomed Jesus joyfully, total hospitality. Of course, this elicits grumbles from those bystanders over there in the back. Zacchaeus is the chief tax collector, and his reputation is summed up in their name for him: sinner. Like Matthew, he was in league with the Romans. Whatever he could skim off the top, he took, and he most likely was a pretty rich guy. And as the chief tax collector, he would have been like Matthew, except maybe with more authority and probably richer to boot. Unlike Matthew, however, Zacchaeus opens his mouth. He speaks up. As they're walking to his house, he stops dead right in the middle of the road and calls Jesus Kyrios, Lord. And he says, behold, half of my possessions, Lord, I shall give to the poor. And if I have extorted anything from anyone, I shall repay it 4 times over. Well, that's quite a turnaround. Clearly, Jesus' attention has touched this man deeply. This encounter is changing him. Jesus, too, is moved by his experience of Zacchaeus, declaring, today salvation has come to this house, because this man, too, is a descendant of Abraham. That word today echoes the today of his first words to Zacchaeus. At first, it was simply marking the moment. Now it takes on the weight of salvation. It's no coincidence that this word today in Greek, semeron, there you go, that's what it looks like, appears in this context 4 other times in Luke's gospel. And I just list them for you. The angel's announcement to the shepherds, today I bring you tidings of great joy. The second one is when Jesus speaks in the synagogue at Nazareth and says, today all the things I've just read to you are fulfilled. All right. The third one is the healing of the paralytic. And the fourth, and the reaction of the crowd, they say, today, it's something remarkable. We've never seen anything like that. And finally, the last one, a little darker, Jesus responds to Herod and says, today I am going to move on. So today, semeron, today. Now, in this story, everything is in motion. It's full of climbing, running, scrambling down, welcoming with joy. And, you've got that great tree there in the background. Um, and by the way, a sycamore tree was sort of a traditional symbol for wisdom and for the rabbinic knowledge. So it's interesting that it's that kind of tree that Zacchaeus climbs. It's a very different energy from what we felt from the woman in John chapter 8 or from Peter on the shore in Luke 5. And yet all three encounters share something essential. In each one, as I've said before, Jesus restores someone to himself or herself. He returns them to the truth of who they are before God. He gives back what shame or fear or reputation had taken away. Zacchaeus' story ends with that strong, ringing word, today. Today, salvation has come to this house. Not someday, not when he has proven himself, not after he's fixed everything, but today, in the very moment of being seen and called by name. The grace of God is not theoretical. It arrives in the present tense today. So let's pause again with that word, today. Not to analyze it, but simply to let it settle in us. What might it mean that salvation, restoration, or a new beginning can happen in the middle of an ordinary day? In the middle of our own mixed motives, our own limitations, our own longing to see Jesus, even if it's from a distance. What might it mean that Jesus is already seeking us today, even when we think we're the ones doing the seeking? Now, I'd ask you to hold those three people in your mind for a minute: the woman, Peter, and Zacchaeus. Three very different lives, three very different circumstances, three very different ways of meeting Jesus. And yet, in each one, that essential thing happens. They are seen, they are spoken to, or spoken with, and they are restored. So here they are, seen, spoken with, restored. None of them comes to Jesus with everything in order. None of them arrives with a polished story or perfect record. Peter is ashamed and unsure of who he is anymore. The woman is terrified and exposed. Zacchaeus is curious, compromised, and maybe a little lonely up in that tree. But Jesus meets everyone, each one, exactly where they are, and something in them opens up. Something in them recognizes the voice that calls them back to themselves. So, as we're getting close to the end now, I'd like to invite you to notice in yourself, or ask yourself, which one of these three stories feels closest to you today? Not forever, not as a label, but just right now, in this moment, today. Is there a place in your life where you feel dragged into the center, vulnerable, judged, exposed, not happy? A place where you feel like Peter, longing to begin again, but not really sure how? Or maybe it's a place where you're like Zacchaeus, seeking from a distance, curious, hopeful, not quite sure what Jesus might say if he stopped beneath your branch and looked up. Wherever you find yourself, hear the words that beat at the heart of this encounter, of these encounters today. a word that echoes the immediacy of grace in every meeting with Jesus. Not when you're ready, not once you fix things, not after I've earned it, but today. Today, you are seen. Today, I'm seen. Today, you're called by name. Today, I'm called by name. Today, grace is already moving toward you and toward me. So I'm just going to invite you to just take a moment there, give you a little bit of atmosphere. Which story feels closest? Who would you like to maybe dialogue with later on, talk to, ask about what that experience with Jesus felt like? I have one last slide to share with you. We'll take that last moment of quiet with this sunset. Let the stories rest in us now tonight. Let the word today rest in us. And then simply allow ourselves to be found by the one who seeks and saves what is lost, including the parts of us that we've forgotten, hidden, or given up on. That's my prayer for each one of us tonight, that the word today rests in you. May it accompany all of us for the rest of this Lent. Thank you.